Alright, party people, day 2 of graphing absolute value functions. Right, so let's review what the parent function for an absolute value function looks like. Y equals the absolute value of x. It's going to go through the origin, and it's going to be positive on both sides of my x-axis. Looks like that. Alright, so now let's look at the difference between the parent function and then a negative absolute value of x. Okay, well the only difference is it's going to flip it upside down. Right, because if we plug in a negative 3 in here, it's going to be negative, the absolute value of negative 3, which is a negative 3. Same thing with negative 2, it's going to be negative 2. So we have the point negative 3, negative 3, negative 2, negative 2, negative 1, negative 1. 0 is still 0. If we plug in a 1 right here, we have the absolute value of 1, which is a positive 1, but then a negative outside, it's back to a negative 1, negative 2, negative 3. So we can tell that the difference between the two is that it looks like it was reflected over the, you guessed it, x-axis. Right? So all we did was turn it upside down because we reflected it over the x-axis. So a negative outside the absolute value reflects it. Now let's look at what happens if we have a constant outside of the absolute value. So we have 2 times the absolute value of x. So 2 times the absolute value of negative 3, which would be 2 times 3, which is a positive 6. Negative 2, absolute value of negative 2 is a positive 2. 2 times positive 2 is 4. Negative 1 is a positive 1. 2 times 1 is 2. 0 is still 0. 1 is 2. 2 is 4. And 3 is 6. Right, so let's plot these points. We've got a point at negative 3, 6, so off the graph. We've got a point at negative 2, positive 4. Negative 1, positive 2. 0 is still 0. And you have the same thing on the other side. Okay, so let's compare that to our parent function. We can see that it got narrower. We call this a vertical stretch. Vertical stretch by a factor of 2. Alright, let's look at the difference. Right, so this was a constant of 2, this is a constant of 1/2. What's the difference? We plug in a negative 3, we get 1.5. We plug in negative 2, we get 1. Plug in negative 1, we get 0.5. Plug in 0, we still get 0. We plug in 1, we get 0.5. And bada bing, bada boom. So negative 3, 1.5. Negative 2, 1. Negative 1.5, 0 still 0. And then we have the same thing on the other side, right? So you can tell the difference. It got wider. And we call that a vertical compression. Más examples. More examples, right? Okay, so let's look at some examples here. So 3 times the absolute value of x. Okay, so let's make our t-chart. Let's plug in negative 2. So we plug in negative 2 here. Negative 2, the absolute value of negative 2 is a positive 2. So we get positive 6. We plug in negative 1, we get positive 3. We plug in 0, we still get 0. We plug in positive 1, we're back to 3. So you can see we have a vertical stretch again. Okay, now let's look at the difference between these two. Because this is the absolute value of 1/4 x. This is 3 times the absolute value of x. Alright. So to plug in negative 2, we've got 1/4 times negative 2 is going to be 1/2. Negative 1/2, but then we can take the absolute value, it's positive 0.5. So negative 2, positive 0.5. Okay, we plug in negative 1, we get a negative 1/4 inside the absolute value. So it's a positive 1/4, so positive 2.5. 0 is still 0. And then the same thing on the other side, right? So you can see we have our vertical compression. Vertical compression. Okay, let's look at, ooh, goodness, some of these that are a little bit harder. Okay, so let's see what changed here. We have transformation, 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 transformation. Okay, so let's talk about what each one of these does. Okay, this is going to translate it up 1 unit from the origin. This is going to translate it left 1 unit. So there is my vertex. This is going to make it a vertical stretch, and this is going to reflect it over the x-axis. So I know I have a point at 0, -1. Okay, let's find some other points. Sorry, I have a point at -1, 0, excuse me. Okay, so let's plug in -2. So -2 plus 1 is a -1, absolute value of -1 is a +1. Okay, times the -2 is a -2, plus 1 is a -1. We already know we have the point -1, 0. Let's plug in 0, we get 1. Okay, times -2 is a -2, and then again -1. So here is your absolute value. Bada bing, bada boom.